Hello, this is your Executive Director, Reverend Angelia Swartz-Coleman, PhD, and I am presenting today the National Child Traumatic Stress Network's presentation of using the secondary traumatic stress core competencies in trauma-informed supervision. And this is a training available through Healing Families Lives. Introduction. As the topic of secondary traumatic stress, or STS, emerges, two facts are becoming clear to program leaders. Quality supervision is an important support that organizations can provide to staff members at risk of developing secondary traumatic stress. And the field hasn't defined what compromises quality supervision in the context of secondary trauma support. The STS Supervisory Competencies is a tool that individuals and organizations can use as a benchmark of the competencies needed to provide effective STS supervision, and is also a map to resources that can help address gaps in those competencies. Because we want our organizations to be there for our clients. And if we don't really know what we're doing or, how to do it, then that's a problem. How to use the STS Supervisor Competency Tool. Number 1. The competencies identified in this tool are intended to apply to all organizations in which services are provided to persons who have experienced trauma. And Healing Families Lives does do that. We do psychological first aid and counseling. These competencies are relevant to any supervisor providing formal support to workers who are exposed to secondary trauma. And that's through hearing it from other people, secondary trauma. The supervisors may be licensed clinicians, or they may be caseworkers or peer providers. I have an equivalency to a PhD, meaning I studied over 150 credit hours, but I didn't apply for the degree. I didn't write a dissertation. I had no desire to be a licensed psychologist. Too many hoops on that one. But I do have a psychological first aid certification level 2 from Kentucky Community Crisis Response Board. And we also have a licensed professional clinical counselor who's volunteered counseling hours for us. And we have Kentucky Psychological Association partners who work with abusers who want to change and get help. Number 2, the competencies tool is intended to be a developmental assessment for supervisors. There is no assumption that the supervisor will possess all of these competencies. No one's perfect. You don't have to be perfect to help other people. Rather, this aid is intended to identify areas of need and to guide the user to resources to strengthen those areas of competency. Excuse me. Number 3, this tool can be used by an individual supervisor, but has greater power as part of an organizational effort. Individuals who wish to use the tool to self-audit their areas of knowledge and skills can use the results to locate resources and increase knowledge and skills. Organizations that serve trauma-exposed clients are encouraged to use this tool to guide all their supervisors in a self-evaluation of these competencies, and to identify resources and develop training priorities based on the links provided within the tool. Secondary traumatic stress, or STS, core competencies for supervisors. Number 1, knowledge of the signs, symptoms, and risk factors of STS and its impact on employees. Knowledge of agency support options, referral process for employee assistance, or external support resources for supervisees who are experiencing symptoms of STS. Number 2, knowledge and capacity to self-assess, monitor, and address the supervisor's personal STS. Number 3, knowledge of how to encourage employees in sharing the emotional experience of doing trauma work in a safe and supportive manner. Number 4, skills to assist the employee in emotional re-regulation after difficult encounters. Because some of the things you hear when you're working with people who have experienced trauma can be pretty bad. And if you're not used to dealing with that or hearing that, then it's going to affect you. Capacity to assess the effectiveness of intervention, monitor progress, and make appropriate referrals if necessary. And back there, you'll see a red binder behind me on my desk. That is our community referral partner binder. It is full of names, so if there's something we can't handle, I can get you to somebody who can. And every organization needs that. Number 5, knowledge of basic psychological first aid. Okay, like I said, I have that, and I think anyone who's going to work with people who are traumatized should have that. Or other supportive approaches to assist staff after an emergency or crisis event. Number 6, ability to both model, that is to show and coach supervisors in using a trauma lens to guide case conceptualization and service delivery. And that's why I'm a big believer that you need some kind of psychological background in order to work with traumatized people. Because you can mean well. I know there are a lot of ministries who do that. But there are certain psychological components that affect people mentally and emotionally that if you don't have the background to understand that, then I feel like you're doing your client a disservice. Number 7, knowledge of resiliency factors and ability to structure resilience building into the individual and group supervisory activities. Again, if you study psychology, you will learn about resiliency, and that's how quickly or fully a person is able to overcome something that's happened to them, because your recovery depends on resiliency. And if your employees are being traumatized because they can't, deal with what they're hearing, then that's also not a good thing for your agency. Number 8, ability to distinguish between expected changes in supervisee perspectives and cognitive distortions related to indirect trauma exposure. And I know some social workers and psychologists who do experience burnout. They get to the point where there's like, I know it sounds terrible, but I don't even care. I don't want to hear another story from these people. It's just too much. I don't want to deal with it. And then, where does that leave the person that you're trying to help? Number 9, ability to use appropriate self-disclosure in supervisory sessions to enhance the supervisee's ability to recognize, acknowledge, and respond to the impact of indirect trauma. And any of you who know me know I had a light stroke years ago, and so if you're just now catching me and saying, wow, this lady can't talk, yeah, you're right. But it's not because I don't know how, or I'm not articulate enough. It's that I have some fried synapses, and what's in here doesn't always make it out here the way I would like it to, but it still works, so that's the important thing. But you want your people to be able to talk to you about feeling traumatized. Competency and operational definition. Number 1, knowledge of the signs, symptoms, and risk factors of STS and its impact on employees, knowledge of agency support options, referral process for employee assistance, or external support resources for supervisees who are experiencing symptoms of STS. Your supervisor is able to do the following. And these are things you want your supervisor, your executive director, your counseling director to be able to do. Recognize the signs of STS in their supervisees. Means they can tell by the way you're talking or acting that there's a problem. Address observed STS with symptomatic employees in a supportive or volunteers. We're all volunteers at this agency, and I know a lot of agencies still are all volunteers, in a manner that normalizes their responses. And one of the things you learn in psychological first aid is that you're having a normal reaction to an abnormal circumstance. Promotes resiliency, meaning, you can overcome faster. And is supportive of the supervisee and does not pathologize, excuse me, meaning you don't start whipping out clinical terms. Oh, you got this, you want to talk to them like they're, not your patient or your client, like they're your, co-worker. Demean, you certainly don't want to put anybody down. Or threaten the supervisee, saying, hey, if you don't get it together and do your job, you're gone. But sometimes you do have to do that, but not because they're having problems adapting to, learning about trauma and hearing traumatic stories. Delineate what the STS information services and support options are available from the organization. So, excuse me, if we had any volunteers that became traumatized by something they heard, they could come to me, they could come to our counselor. We definitely have that in place to where, if someone was to have this problem, we could get them, some help. Facilitate the referral process for accessing available quality services for symptomatic employees. And that's a thing here in Louisville, and that's why Healing Families Lives was started, that these types of services, there are centers who are very full. They have months backlog on counseling. So, that's why we started Healing Families Lives, is we hope to be a backup, for these agencies. They were not interested in that, which is a shame. But we are here, for anyone who needs us. Identify other resources that provide STS prevention or intervention services and is able to assist the employee in accessing those resources. And when we mentor our clients, so that, if they were having any problems like that, we could get them, somewhere, where they had the resources to help, and I think I said clients, I mean volunteers and employees, hopefully in the future, to get them to where they need to go. Encourage the consistent use of organizational supports for the mitigation, prevention of STS symptoms as a normalized part of doing this work. Because if you do this work, if you work with individuals and families who are affected by domestic abuse or sexual assault and molestation, you're going to hear their stories. And you have to be able to handle that. And if you cannot handle that, then you should not get into that line of work. And if you need to go study psychology or go talk to a counselor to feel like you need to prepare yourself for that, then by all means do that. Act as an advocate within the organization for STS supports, training, or another needed adjustment needed by supervisees indicated by supervisory monitoring of STS symptoms in supervisees. So certainly if, I was to see that somebody's having some problems dealing with these people, I would say, are you okay? Seems to me like, maybe this is getting to you, you need to be there for your people, because that's how your organization runs, especially volunteers. Differentiate STS, PTSD, and burnout symptoms, and describe the differential varying responses to each condition. So if you never dealt with that, you might have secondary traumatic stress by hearing these people's stories. Or if this is something that was in your life, and maybe this is why you got involved in this, you could bring on a PTSD episode by hearing someone else's stories if it was similar to yours. Or if you've been doing this a while, and it's just getting to be too much, it feels like too heavy a burden, then maybe you might be burnt out a little bit. And, a good supervisor is going to be able to catch on to that. Identify how race, historical trauma, implicit bias, and or cultural impacts the way STS manifests at the individual and organizational levels. So let's just be honest here. I am not a prejudiced person. I'm a multi-ethnic person, so I can't be prejudiced because then I'd be prejudiced to some part of myself. But race does play a factor. Wherever there's a heavy concentration of people, you're going to have more violence. So it just goes to say, in poorer neighborhoods where minorities live, there are more people. That means there's going to be more violence. So that's just a fact. Historical trauma, okay? Slavery, discrimination, historical trauma. Places where you have historical trauma, they might not be as welcoming to you if you are light-skinned and trying to help them out and they are dark-skinned. I have run across that. I think that's a shame because I was not, raised to be like that. And, I think when you discount someone because of the color of their skin, you're not going to learn all you need to learn from this person. Just, that's the way it is. Implicit bias, okay? If you're already prejudiced, you don't need to be going in areas where, you might be prejudiced against somebody. You don't need to do that because that's going to show, and then you're ineffective. Cultural impacts, again, if someone came from a war-torn area and there's discord in their home, they're probably already in a bad state of PTSD. So if you're treating somebody from the Middle East, you have to realize the cultural impact plus, the domestic violence impact is going to be there. Number 2, knowledge and capacity to self-assess, reflective capacity to monitor. So that means you have to assess yourself, and you have to assess your volunteers or employees. To monitor, keep an eye on them too, and address the supervisor's own, traumatic stress symptoms. Because, if you are in a place where you can't deal with this, then, how are you going to help your volunteers or employees deal with this? And the easy answer to that is you can't. So you have to be able to keep up with your own self. I'm pretty much nonchalant to it now. I have grown up with enough trauma and went through support groups with other people and have heard enough. I've worked with, I think it's over 180 clients and families now, and you probably can't tell me anything I haven't heard. In fact, someone asked me what was the worst thing I heard one time, and I told them, and it was definitely not as bad as what they had to tell me. So they felt much better about telling me their story after they heard what the worst thing I ever heard was. And it was really bad. So the supervisor is able to do the following: recognize the effect of race, historical trauma, implicit bias, culture and or other trauma exposure upon themselves, or, him or herself, and describe how it may manifest in the supervisory process. Well, of course, I do have that. And, I don't feel like in my case it affects any race, history, implicit bias about any culture. Because, like I said, I am multi-ethnic. So, there's no specific color person, I believe, does this kind of thing. And if you feel that way, then you shouldn't be doing this. That's just a fact. Self-assess for signs and symptoms of secondary traumatic stress that is affecting their own functioning on a regular basis. Now, if I would have tried to do this back in my 20s, that would have been disastrous because I was still attending counseling and support group, and I would not have been able to do this. So, sometimes people have good intentions, but then they get in there and they realize, oh no, I can't handle this. I can't do this. So, if you are a person, and a lot of people I know who work with people who've been traumatized have had trauma in their past, make sure you've dealt with that. Make sure you've gone through counseling, support groups. Make sure you've done your head work, your heart work, so that other people's trauma does not spill into you. Define a plan for regular reflection on to identify and self-assess secondary traumatic stress. So if you're working in an environment where people are being really, stressed and they don't have a background, in trauma treatment or a background with trauma, you might want to have like maybe a meeting once a week or every couple of weeks with your volunteers or employees and say, okay, let's talk about this. Does anything come up that's a problem for anybody? Is anybody feeling, like they're maybe have some secondary traumatic stress? And that way you can help these people. Willingly seek support from peers or own supervisor. Again, everybody needs a little help sometimes. And if you feel like you do, you should get it because your organization will suffer if you don't. Competency. Number 3, knowledge of how to encourage employees in sharing the emotional experience of doing trauma work in a safe and supportive manner. Now, I get a little lecture every now and then because I'm told I go into parts of town that are not safe. But that's where these people live. And I don't have a problem going to any part of town, especially one where a certain area of the population doesn't think the other area is safe. So again, you don't want to put yourself in harm's way. You certainly would not go to, like, if someone were to call me and say he's abusing me, come now, help me. I would say, I'm sorry, I don't do that. That's not my job. That's the police's job. Call 911 right now. So you have to be sensible about these things. But, after that, you can certainly say, let me come out and talk to you. Do some psychological first aid. Operational definition. The supervisor is able to do the following. Employ skills to enhance psychological safety of supervisees during supervision. Because you want your people, to feel like they're doing something good. And you want them to be, mentally and emotionally healthy. So again, you don't want to expose someone to something that they're just not ready for. Describe common emotional responses to trauma work. So, like, as you have a volunteer or employee first come in, you can talk to them and say, here's what you're probably going to hear. Some of the things could be like this. Are you able to handle that? If someone tells you, and you don't have to go into explicit detail and put them into trauma right there on their first, day. But you can talk to them and feel them out and see, have they dealt with anything like this? Are they able to deal with anything like this? Because some people just aren't. And then that means that trauma work is not right for them. Skillfully employ reflective listening as part of supervisory practice. As a supervisor, sometimes you get busy and you feel like, I don't have time for this. But skillful listening, you need to listen to your employees because that way you learn out if there's a problem. What's working, what's not working. Identify and utilize supervisee strengths in order to use data to increase supervisee self-awareness, competence, and resilience. And that means, what are they good at? What was their best subject? If someone has a fear, of dogs, you certainly wouldn't want to put them in a situation where they're working with dogs on a regular basis. Whereas, if you have someone who is not mentally strong, who caves under the slightest pressure, you don't want to put them in to a situation where they're being bombarded by, traumatic information. So you have to kind of look at your people. There have been people who, have thought they might like to volunteer, and we start getting into things, and I start talking about things. I can just see the detach. I can just see the shock starting, and I'm like, nope, because you have to be functional if you're going to help other people. You can't help anyone else if you're not helping yourself. Normalize common emotional responses to trauma work during supervision. Tell them, this stuff's just going to happen. If it starts happening, let me know. We'll deal with it. Provide emotional support to supervisees, and how to determine what method may be most helpful to supervisees. So you need to have a plan in place for that. You need to know what happens if they start feeling, secondary traumatic stress symptoms, and have a plan in place for that. Number 4, knowledge of skills to assist the employee in emotional re-regulation and after difficult encounters. Because sometimes, if it's a really difficult encounter, it's okay to go to the bathroom and cry. It's okay. Say, I need a moment. Go to your car. Take a breath. Go get a drink, whatever. Not an alcoholic drink like water. So that you come back to where you need to be. Because sometimes it just takes a little bit of adjustment. Capacity to assess the effectiveness of intervention. How effective is this going to be? And talking about, people with stress. In our early organization, we had a woman who couldn't even handle, coming to board meetings. You can't handle coming to a board meeting. How are you going to handle dealing with traumatized people? Answer there, you're not. Monitor progress and make appropriate referrals if necessary. The supervisor is able to do the following. Educate supervisees. Define self-regulation, meaning, they have to be able to regulate themselves. You can't walk them and hold their little hand through everything. And I've met some people who are survivors of trauma who cannot self-regulate. They really do need someone to hold their hand. But that's not good for them. You should not do that for them. You need to teach them how to do that for themselves. That's the whole point. Teach self-regulation skills. If the person needs that and you think they're going to work out and they're going to be good at this, then you might have to teach them how to self-regulate. Normalize emotional responses to difficult situations. Again, you tell them in the first meeting, you might have some emotional responses because of this work. You're going to hear some horrible things sometimes, and that's normal in this work, because if they're going to do this kind of work, they have to be able to handle it. All right, well, that was our bell, so that's all for this presentation today. Again, this is the Using the Secondary Traumatic Stress Core Competencies in Trauma-Informed Supervision from the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, and Healing Families' Lives. Does come out to organizations and present this presentation. So if you'd be interested in us doing that at your organization, you can give us a call. You can check our Facebook page, or you can message us here, or you can email healingfamilieslives@gmail.com, or just comment on here, and we would be happy in the Louisville and surrounding areas to come out and do that for you. And of course, being that we are a nonprofit, we do suggest that if you would like to make a donation to us, that you do that. That way that helps us be able to afford gas and printing out of materials. to come and make that presentation to you. So I will continue this next time. And thank you. Please like, subscribe, and share if you feel like it. Until next time.